All good.
Okay, so before we get to our own introductions, I just wanted to give a brief intro to our topic that we've chosen and why we've chosen it. So the environmental field is incredibly complex, and the issues that are found in this field and finding the solutions require a lot of input from a variety of different sectors. And economics tend to be some of the most contentious ways of finding solutions and aspects of those solutions because of the inherent costs related to creating these different systems. And a lot of them don't fit into the current economic model, at least that we have here in the US. So we hope with this conversation to get more into these difficult topics and just discuss in the face of global climate change how we can work economics and different types of economic systems and solutions into creating a better world for humans and the environment. So from there, I'm going to have us all just give short introductions. First, the interns. So I am Linnea Tutsov. I'm currently a policy intern here at Audubon, Vermont. And I'm also a master's in environmental law and policy student at Vermont Law School. Christina, do you want to go next?
Hi, my name is Christina Cambria. I am also a policy intern with Audubon, Vermont, and I am a 3L at Vermont Law School, all set to graduate in May. Monica?
Hi, my name is Monica Diaz. I am a recent graduate of Amherst College, where I studied biology and was engaged in some bird research on black-capped chickadees and tree swallows. And I'm currently a policy intern for Audubon, Vermont. And I guess we can, Mia, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah. I'm Mia. I am also an intern at Audubon, Vermont, and I'm an education intern. I am currently in my final year getting my Bachelor of Science in Environmental Studies at UVM. Yeah.
So now we're going to move forward to the panelists. We're going to ask each one to give up to a 5-minute introduction of themselves, their personal relationship to the environment, how they came to this field of study, and just anything they would like to add. So we're going to go Rigo, Sam, and then Skylar.
Oh, hi. So yeah, my name is Rigo Melgar. I'm a PhD candidate at UVM, and I study ecological economics. I guess I've been involved in the environmental field since, I don't know, 15 years ago. I watched Inconvenient Truth, actually, and that's what got me interested in climate change specifically. But then I went to study environmental studies and science, and I continue on until now that I'm doing a PhD. But very much interested now in the energy transition and seeing how, trying to understand how we can actually transform our system to be more just and sustainable.
Sam, if you want to go next.
Hey, I'm Sam Bliss. I'm a PhD student also at the University of Vermont, and it's a program that's very similar to the one that Rigo's part of. My relationship to the environment is that I am the environment. I'm made out of it, just like we all are. And that fact that like our food is us like turning the environment into our bodies makes me interested in food especially, but I think also the fact that there's no separation between the environment and ourselves, and that separation is something that's like construction of our minds and our cultures is like something that's inspired me to get involved in environmental activism, defending nature, defending the climate. And in my trajectory to ecological economics, I think I learned about studied environmental economics as an undergrad, and that is like standard economics as applied to the environment. And so that's some of the things we're going to be talking about in this webinar come from the idea of like using economic incentives to protect the environment, protect natural resources, prevent pollution. But the assumptions behind some of those policies are that everything should be bought and sold, and that the whole natural world should be divided up into private property. And so I've come to regard some of these tools with like a healthy skepticism, while appreciating their usefulness for motivating actors in the economy to like make better decisions with respect to the environment. So that's sort of the preamble for me.
And Skylar, if you want to go next.
Oh, there we go. Hey, thanks for having me, and good to hear from folks. Let's see. I was in the old program that Sam's current advisor was my old advisor. So it's kind of a small world there. I went down to DC after I did my master's and focused a lot on macroeconomics and steady state economics, which is sort of a nice counter, I think, to discussions about economic efficiency on sort of the microeconomic level. And now I'm starting a program called Regenerate, and we're going to focus on media and film dedicated to sustainable economy in general. And I got really excited about the idea of talking about nature, because usually we sort of focus more on the academic side of things. And I sort of have gone into a bit more of a philosophical journey over the last 5 years, thinking about what is nature. And as I started to see these sort of ecological economic patterns and the interaction between economies and nature, my eyes sort of began to open around this. And so I prepared 2 quotes that I'd like to share that sort of speak to me about this. And the first is Immanuel Kant's idea that an organized product in nature is one in which everything is reciprocally ends and means. And I think with the economy, what we see is basically a transformation of the earth to what we're calling an economic end, monetary value of some sort. And I think the big challenge for the sustainability movement is to see how we can turn that into a reciprocal relationship, so that everything that's part of our ecological economy is both an end and a means, so that we're not linearly transforming ourselves into oblivion, basically. And the other quote that I really appreciate is one of Thich Nhat Hanh's, who passed recently. And he has this sentiment: a flower is not a flower. It is made of only non-flower elements, sunshine, clouds, time, space, earth, minerals, gardeners, and so on. He goes on to say, a rose is not a rose. And lately, I've been looking into the relationship between pollinators and flowers. And there's this remarkable way in which like the hardwiring of bees. Bees are basically hardwired to appreciate different elements of flowers, their color, their smell, their shape. And there's this coevolution that's happened. And when you think about nature, this coevolution is not just between, say, elements of a food chain, but it includes the climate, the soil, all of these elements. And so there's this sort of romantic idea of nature that every organism is, in a sense, this reflection of everything else, and there's this remarkable interdependence. And I'm introducing that idea because I think that's also true of the economy. And when we make a payment or a policy decision, it has ramifications that go throughout the economy. And I think it's interesting to keep those in mind as well. And so I'll stop there.
Well, thank you everyone for those introductions. So I think we're going to get into our questions now. And I believe Christina is first to start us off.
Yep, so we're gonna start it off, I think, pretty broad. And our first question is, why should people care about this topic at all? And anyone who wants to jump in first can.
Well, I just spoke, but I'll kick things off on this round too. Well, I think we're at this incredible tipping point in the stage of human civilization and Earth systems, where we're building on the background of 10,000 years of basically population growth, increasing consumption. And now we're getting to a point where Earth systems are beginning to basically unwind. We're going through what people are calling the sixth great extinction. So the rate of species extinction is the fastest it's been in the last 64 million years. And the climate's unwinding. And at the same time, our economic systems, we're dealing with layers of debt that we haven't seen in a long time. So it's time to come up with some solutions. And I think this is one that's being put forward, and it's getting both scrutiny and also there's an opportunity there. So it has a lot of weight on it. I'll just put it that way.
I would add that, like, the idea that like the environment or the environmental crisis is like an issue that we should care about sort of understates it, because it is us. What am I trying to say? Like, everything's interconnected, and I'm sorry, my mind just went blank. Like the ecological economics is sort of like bringing in the natural and social sciences at their intersection. So like the nature is the only source of resources for the economy, and everything around us is made out of nature, and all the processes of taking that nature and turning it into stuff create waste and pollution that then goes back into the environment to affect what nature's out there for us to continue making the economy. So when we talk about the economy, we are talking about the environment, and that can just be concealed by the way that economics is talked about conventionally, which is as money moving around, buying and selling things. The same way that I think ecologists sometimes make the like human impact on the system invisible. Like Skylar was saying, humanity has grown its footprint to sort of affect everything on the surface of the earth. Now with climate change, like there's no corner of the earth that's spared. So I think talking about these things together and their intersection is something that's not yet fully understood. I mean, that we're still like working on, but like a conversation really worth having.
Yeah, I agree with Sam and Skylar. I think I accepted to come here because it is an opportunity to talk about what I consider what we need to do in this decade of action. We need a just sustainability transition to a right-sized economy, and what we're talking about oftentimes is almost like these conventional fixes, such as cap and trade or pricing carbon, when what we need to do is transform the systems, the social and the economic systems which are unjust and unsustainable and inefficient. So ecological economics, like Sam and Scholar have pointed out in different ways, looks at the system as, for you to have an efficient, economics is defined as the efficient allocation of scarce resources, right? Economics 101, you get that definition. But the problem that ecological economists Keith pointed out, is you cannot have an efficient allocation without first having a sustainable understanding of what will be the scale that the planet can sustain, right, without having climate change or acidifying the oceans. And then after you actually understand what that sustainable scale is, you can go and you need to also understand what is the just distribution of the resources that we do have to give to the population. And then after that, you can get to efficiency. You can get to hopefully try to efficiently allocate resources. But it goes beyond just market market solutions, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess going off of that, this was one of our further questions further on, but we were planning on asking about cap and trade programs and other market-based solutions like that for reducing carbon emissions and consumption. So since you brought it up and seem to disagree with the effectiveness of those, what needs to be done then instead in like a systems thinking based mindset instead of just having a cap on carbon emissions? That can be for anyone too.
Well, for the sake of keeping rolling, I'll circle back and say one kind of point that we'll be able to talk about further is what are the sort of macroeconomic. So just to frame this, right? So I like where Rigo is going. The scale of the economy is the total size of the economy. So it's one way to measure that is in terms of GDP. And what we've seen is this scale of the economy growing and growing and growing and growing. And ecological economists say, we can't really keep doing that because that, as we've been saying, the economic exchanges, even measured in monetary terms, are directly connected to energy and matter and biodiversity and all these things. So what happens is when you put conventional economists take the economy and they don't really think about how big the total economy is. They think about the relative value of goods and services. So they'll say, well, if we put more money into conservation, then this will be great. We'll have the green economy and the normal economy, and it will sort of all go together. And what we're saying is that you can't have two. It's, it's the total economy, and the size matters, that scale matters. Now, where there's an interesting question is how microeconomic tools, such as putting more value on this or that, also influences the macroeconomy. And I think that could be where we have some discussion. So I'll say, as my way of kicking this part off of what can we do, I think it can be important that the microeconomic tools are used to actually limit the scale of the economy. And one sort of interesting reflection on this is leading up to the 2008 collapse, there was this fluctuation in oil prices that had been going on for about 8 years, 6 years maybe, due to the Iraq war. And then you finally see the oil prices spike. And during that time, the people were basically taking their money out of productive assets, putting them into this volatile system, and finally the system collapsed. So it really does matter, and it does make an impact what the prices of these base resources that fuel the whole economy are. And sort of the question is, in my perspective, how do we take that into account and then use that to get in the direction we need to go with a just and systemic change? And sorry, I didn't answer your question, but maybe that sort of cues up where we could go with it.
Yeah, let's talk about the cap and trade as a proposal, or carbon tax. These are like economic incentives around carbon emissions. So carbon tax is maybe simpler to understand. It's just for every ton or kilogram of CO2 emitted from a smokestack, tailpipe, wherever, you have to pay the government, say $30 for a ton, maybe 35. I don't know. The policy doesn't exist. Cap and trade is a little different because they set a cap on the maximum amount of carbon emissions that are allowed to be emitted, distribute that many permits up to the cap to all the people who have smokestacks and tailpipes, and say, okay, you can trade those permits amongst yourselves, but that's the cap. And so the trading of those permits generates revenue, and in either case, the price of fuel, the price of electricity, the price of carbon emitting things that we purchase is going up. So one critique of these policies is that it raises the price of basic goods, because everything we have is based on fossil fuels. Manufacturing goods uses fossil fuels, shipping them uses fossil fuels, getting to work uses fossil fuels, right? Coal, oil, and gas are always burning. And so that comes down way harder on the poor, because with these policies, as they're proposed in their most basic form, they're raising the price of basic necessities for people who are living paycheck to paycheck, at the same time as they're probably not changing the price of things enough to convince the rich to take that many fewer flights, to take out their super yacht less often, these big, less essential carbon emitting activities. Now, there's modifications to this proposal where the revenue from a carbon tax or cap and trade program is distributed equally to everyone. So you get a check in the mail that's like your stimulus check, that everybody gets the same check, just like a stimulus, and it's based on all the revenue from taxing carbon or from a cap and trade. And because the wealthy, the top 10% of emitters in a country like the United States, are responsible for so much more carbon emissions than everybody else, most people would come out on top. Their check would be bigger than their tax burden. But it's been a really hard sell with those sorts of policies. Like these ideas have been around for 15, 20 years, really actually longer. But there was a bill around 2008, the Waxman-Markey bill, for a cap and trade program. It's come up at the state level multiple times. There's California and the Northeast have small cap and trade programs for power plants, for electricity producing stations. And it's not made that much of a difference. Here we are, and we need something much more drastic, in my opinion, and something that's like really tangibly about keeping fossil fuels in the ground, like a moratorium on new oil and gas extraction or something like that. So that's my provocative counter proposal to a carbon tax, is just to make it illegal to start new projects that are for taking fossil fuels out of the ground in the first place.
I could just add something to this. So okay, this is what the biggest problem here is, and I think this is one of the biggest problems, not the biggest, but probably one of the biggest. Ultimately, we cannot. Well, the European Union, for example, has had a cap and trade system that has not really. I mean, it has not done much, but even if you were to have one, you would have to have one globally too, because the United States could do everything you wanted. The European Union could do everything you wanted, but then you have China that now produces twice, as much as the United States, and combine what the European Union and the United States produces of emissions. So you'll be canceled out. So you'll have to have a global system. But the problem is that the market and the way, the laissez-faire system, in which we don't want government intervention, and neoliberalism especially has taken over for the past 40 plus years. That is the system. This complete free market thinking that we're just going to let it to the market to solve things is what has led us not only to this problem to begin with. So the emissions have come from just not giving a damn about polluting the environment and ignoring the scientists, right? Because we want to make as much, the oil companies and everyone wants to make money as And I understand the need to make profits, but the problem is that the scientists have been ignored, and the market has been prioritized. So the market that has gotten us to this problem is not going to help us fix the problem. We have, what is it, the IPCC said this week, 8 years to really start cutting half the emissions by the 1930s, and then hopefully get net zero by 2050s. So that is the bottom line of why these things, I think, are so frustrating. I wish the market could help us more, but ultimately, if you just let it to the forces of the market, to the invisible hand, right, that it has, you hear all about in Econ 101, that's what ecological economics was created for, to say that that doesn't work. You need to have a system in which we come together. And I have a quote here, just quickly, from Donella Meadows, who some of you might be familiar with. And she wrote, "The scarcest resource is not oil, metals, clean energy, capital, labor, or technology. It is our willingness to listen to each other and learn from each other, and to seek the truth rather than seek to be right." And I think that says it all, I think, at this point. But
I'll just piggyback on that real quick. One of my favorite studies, I think Josh was talking about one time, is this notion that if you put people in a room together and you have to collectively decide how much a common asset is worth, as people begin to talk about these things, they realize how much everybody else, say you're talking about the lake, and we have, this group sitting around, we're all talking about how much the lake matters to us. You start to hear everybody else's stories, and then you start to realize, wow, this lake actually really does matter to all of us, and your value for it goes up. Whereas if you just ask each individual, how much does the lake matter to you? They might say, oh yeah, I go, twice a summer and not as much. And so that's an example of how the institution of the market, how if we're all making these individual choices, it's really difficult to come to that collective consensus about the value of what are common assets. A stable climate for the whole globe is this enormous common asset, the biodiversity, et cetera. That said, I guess I'll push back kind of for the sake of fun and argument. I think there's, well, actually, I'll ask a question. Do you guys think that the problem is the market instrument itself? Say, leaving justice aside, if the price was strong enough, right? And if the cap and trade, if the scale was strong enough, do you guys think that the market is an effective tool, or is there something intrinsic to the market that makes it not effective?
It's a good question. I mean, it's hard to set justice aside, for one, when we're talking about climate change, but also I think one thing that dissuades me from like enthusiasm about political action toward market-based climate policy or market-based environmental policy is that it's not something people normally take to the streets for, and it is like masses of people taking to the streets that gets reforms enacted in the past, and carbon taxes are especially like their ability to like make potent changes depends on that tax being really big, and like corporations just own the government to too great an extent. Like a $30 a ton carbon tax would make gas a lot more expensive, but not expensive enough to make change away from gasoline powered vehicles as fast as we need it by itself. I didn't answer your question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I could just add that, yeah, you could have like, $200 per ton thing, but if you could even get that to like be discussed in the Congress. They were trying to, I forget what they were trying to do recently, but they're just not gonna do it, especially now with when the gasoline prices are up and you're seeing inflation. That's not even part of the discussion. So you have a situation in which in the United States, they don't want to do anything. They don't want to do, like, not even the market. You would think they would, if they're gonna do anything, right, in the United States, which it will be something market based. That's the ultimate weird thing here that we're confronting, because you have this neoliberalism that has taken over policy in Washington and just since the 1980s. So we're trying to move away from that, and we're seeing some of those signs, but I think ultimately that's the biggest roadblock that we're used to inaction, and whenever you're gonna take action, you ultimately you cannot, even if you were to do a cap and trade or a market base, you cannot just do that one thing. I think I had this model presentation with the interns, and I wish I could have done, maybe at some point you guys can look into it, the En-ROADS model. Basically it shows you that even if you were to do these market-based things, you have to accompany that with subsidies for weatherization to improve efficiency, for example, and then invest in renewables, so we have the alternatives, so we're not dependent on oil and fossil fuels that will become expensive when you increase those taxes or cap it and trade. So I think we have to think more systematically about how we're gonna fix this. And
I'll say real quick, Rigo, when you hit your hands, you can hear it in the mic, just so you know. But I think that's a great point. And I was thinking the other day, it's like, there's a million laws and economic policies. And if we were actually going to have a sustainable economy, all of those would have to be targeting the world that we want, right? A sustainable scale, a just distribution. And I think there's this moment now, it's like, as we're beginning to wake up to the idea of sustainable economy or whatever it is, we say, well, is this one policy going to do the whole thing? Rather than, how can this policy address this, that address that? Like in an ecosystem, if one species dies off, hopefully the whole ecosystem doesn't collapse. And I don't think we would want policies for a sustainable economy to hold that much power. We would want the whole system to be sort of targeting a coherent vision of the world.
Yeah, it's interesting that when the integrated assessment models, which are the climate economy models that scientists use to model future scenarios of how climate change will affect humanity, and that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change relies on for their scenario analyses, those models are by and large based on the assumption that the only economic lever we have for fighting climate change is a carbon tax, which is, it's just so that they can build a very simple model of the human economy without having to get into all the nuance. But I agree, like to have it all hinge on one thing. Yeah, I mean, if a carbon tax were to start feeling politically feasible, we should be for that, like any other climate policy, because it takes so much. So I think we should talk about different ones.
I think we can move on to the next question. And that is, what are your thoughts on alternative economic models? And to name one, degrowth.
I like degrowth. I'm for degrowth. Degrowth is the idea of a planned economic contraction that's like purposefully equitable and redistributive of wealth and power. And so the idea is what Skylar was getting at, that like when the economy grows by say 3%, the total tons of material that get extracted from the environment tends to go up by 3%, and energy use tends to go up by about 3%, carbon emissions by maybe 2%, maybe 1%, depends on the country. because the economy is material and it's run by doing work, by using energy. And so the idea of degrowth is that, okay, what if we did less economic activity in rich countries where there's already way more than enough to go around and it's just poorly distributed? So in a place like the United States, where if you were to take the national income of the United States and divide it amongst everyone, it's like $60,000 a person or something like that. It's like, you're not doing bad if you're a household of 4 and you're making $240,000. You're probably going to be able to make ends meet. The problem is that it's distributed really poorly. So if we do less overall economic activity and focus it on scaling down the most harmful and the most useless sectors, focus on scaling down coal-fired electricity, focus on scaling down like needless polluting luxuries while like maintaining like live music and things that are like per amount of economic activity generated, like somewhat less polluting. That's sort of the idea of degrowth from like a policy perspective. As a social movement, the idea is to oppose economic growth as the goal around which society is organized. Politicians promise growth. They wouldn't think to not promise growth. Growth makes jobs happen, and jobs are really important because our income is our only way to meet our basic needs in a market economy. And so the idea is to repoliticize the environment by saying the environment isn't just something to tack on as another issue, but it's quite political. What resources we're using, where they come from, what the effects on humans and the rest of nature are. I'll let others talk about degrowth too. That's something I'm excited about.
I'm also a proponent of degrowth. I think it's that we're in this state where it's sort of urgent that we start to consider no longer growing. I think both for environmental reasons, but also socially. I think the amount that we're getting from pursuing further growth, from working longer hours, from the development of new technology, we've really passed by a point where it's making us happier, where it's improving our democracy. There's actually abundant research that basically after you get to a state of secure prosperity, not luxury, then everything after that is basically social. So I have a nicer car than you, that makes me happier, right? But it's not a substantive improvement in our lives. And so for these reasons, I think it's sort of urgent that we steer the ship. I think the thing that we have to be careful about, or it's really important that we're proactive about it, because right now money is sort of the glue that holds the world together. We have however many millions of people, across the world, billions of people living in cities. And it's sort of this economic activity, these patterns that have sort of maintained harmony to the extent that the world is harmonious, and the entire structure, the way everything is sort of leveraged on top of each other, sort of assuming this trajectory of continued growth. Once we start to steer that ship, I think we have to be really careful and be proactive and consider the impacts of no longer going in the trajectory that we've been going in.
So alternative systems. The way I see it is largely based on how ecosystems work, right? So people would like to get familiar with Howard Odum. A lot of how I think has been influenced by him, one of the founders of ecology in the United States, along with his brother Eugene Odum. So basically, ecosystems go through cycles, right? Pulsating. He called them pulsating cycles. So, and you can see this a lot in succession. So let's say you are in Puerto Rico, and there's a hurricane. Every other year there's one and destroys an area. And then what happens, is when the ecosystem and area gets destroyed with forests, usually considered with forested ecosystems, then you begin to see succession, right? In which you start seeing growth, and it takes time, but there will be growth going up, and you will get to a point where you get to the climax. They call climax communities, and the canopy, right? It grows to a point that there's not so much nutrients to be taken up by the trees, and it reaches the climax. And then after it reaches the climax, then it can stay like that as a steady state. So we can talk about a steady state economics, or you can have a fire, or you can have a hurricane, or you can have a drought. And now with climate change, where you have fear that the Amazon rainforest, which has this a lot of climate's canopy, then the drought can kill it, right? So anything can happen that can disturb the system, and then you can go down again, but it will go up. So I don't see one way or another. I don't think it's just degrowth or steady state. I think it's learning to understand that the system is supposed to act and behave like an ecosystem, because economy is an ecosystem. And what we need to do right now, and the United States has done it, by the way. There is hope. This is not like hopeless case. I don't believe that addressing climate change is hopeless. The United States for the past 20 years, I wish I have my graphs here to show you, but it's stabilized. The energy consumption of the country has stayed within, is measured with quadrillion units of BTU, within 100, which is a lot of, but it has basically stabilized since the 2000s, even though population has grown with immigration and other things to 330 million people. But so what we need to do first is stabilize. We need to stabilize our consumption in a way that doesn't hurt the people who, the poor and the middle class. And then after that, what we want to do is ramp up efficiency, ramp up conservation of resources, and start decreasing that, because we don't want to keep adding, right? We don't want to grow again. But there will be a time when we have to grow. So there's always a time for growth, and you can see this also in agro systems, right? In just farming, there is always a time for harvesting, a time for growth, and you have these cycles. And I just wanted to get you to think about that, and think about how the ecosystems work is how we are supposed to be working, because we are ultimately nature, like Sam has pointed out and we have pointed out. So that's how I see it.
You're using growth as a metaphor, or like when we talk about like personal growth and spiritual growth. Well, these are like metaphors that we have where we mistake things getting better for things getting bigger, because our society has like equated getting bigger with getting better, because growth is like a major economic and policy goal. But like the growth of crops is not something that like degrowth advocates are against. What we're saying is that the like overall material and energy consumption of the economy needs to decrease in rich countries, and I don't think you can like plausibly argue against that. I think one of the main things that needs to happen is that people's basic needs need to be guaranteed. Like no one's gonna like ever agree to a smaller economy overall if that means recession, if that means that like their access to food and shelter is compromised by such a shrinking. And so it's not necessarily even that like we need to shrink the economy and that might make people's lives better. It's sort of like the process of like pursuing things that we care about, like justice and sustainability, might actually imply a smaller economy. Like if everyone were guaranteed housing rent-free, then we might choose to work less and thus produce less in the economy. We might be able to get by purchasing less because we have more free time, and I'm living in Burlington, like rent is right now 150% of my income. Hopefully it'll get to back down under 100% soon. But I think that's a really typical experience in the urban world today. So I think it's the progress toward the things we care about might necessitate having a biophysically smaller economy.
I just want to piggyback. I think I really like what you guys are both saying, and One thing I was thinking about when it comes to these natural cycles, there's also a time, nature behaves differently at different times in these cycles. So people often say in that early stage of an ecosystem growth, it's all about competition. And there's a role for competition in nature, you know, a diversification and, you know, in early stage ecosystems are like searching for sunlight, right? Oftentimes after a major collapse of an ecosystem, annuals pop up rather than perennials. And then in a later stage, there's different characteristics that the ecosystems take on. And if you're sort of an ecological economist looking at steady states or degrowth systems, we're also sort of looking at what other characteristics of ecosystems exist in those stages. So for example, another one is ecosystems start to prioritize less new growth, but they are also about sort of maintaining existing assets. And if we think about our economy, it might start to be more valuable for us to value what we have, to value our existing housing stock, to value our existing ecological assets. And it's almost, if we don't come to recognize the value of those, we could actually totally undermine them. And that would be bad for the economy and probably nature too.
So I know Sam brought up some justice elements, and we do have some questions about that. But before we get to that, we have one more just related to kind of what we've been talking about already. This is more on a smaller scale. I know we've been talking about like national economies and international economies, but on a smaller scale, what are your thoughts on using economic incentives for private landowners to encourage them to put into place sustainable land practices and minimize development on working lands like forests and farms? So for example, conservation easements, payments for ecosystem services, things like that.
I'll go for it. It's a good question. I think when thinking about the use of incentives for motivating landowners and land managers to make decisions that the rest of society wants them to and thinks are beneficial for everybody else because of those environmental spillovers, you know, landowner might not personally be affected by polluting the water, but whoever lives downstream for sure, especially if Lake Champlain's downstream. When thinking about using incentives, rewards and punishments, typically monetary, I think we need to consult the science of motivation. And what the science of motivation says is that if people are motivated, what's called intrinsic motivation, it's a slippery concept. I think the people who are biggest proponents of this way of thinking don't fully understand what they're talking about and would readily admit it. But when people are motivated by things other than incentives, and then you introduce an incentive, it changes their relationship to whatever it is that you're incentivizing, whatever that work is or whatever the land is. And where it gets really risky is if that incentive goes away. And so we've seen with payments for ecosystem services, or which is a fancy way of saying paying farmers and landowners for the ecological benefits that the rest of society is able to reap from their environmental practices. When those have been put in place, often it is farmers getting paid for things that they were already doing. But then when the money goes away, they stop doing these things that they were already doing because they've become too associated as like work for a wage almost, you know, it's like something that we get from motivation. So that's sort of an indictment of the effectiveness of incentives, but I think there's something deeper to think about as well, as like, is that the way that we want to relate to taking care of the environment? Like is that really the way that we're going to get to like an ecologically sustainable society? So I think that like while these things can be effective, especially for things that are like measurable, I think in some cases the potential long-term effects, or the sort of like, is this a reform that's like instating the current system of a market economy even more? Or is this a reform that's like working in a different direction? Well, I think it's sort of the former.
Yeah, well, going off a bit about how environmental economics affects like everyday people, how do you all think that environmental taxation, including the carbon tax, and would affect like low income communities? And do you think that with this in mind, like the benefits outweigh the costs?
I guess I'll sort of piggyback on what Sam was saying in your question is, when it comes to addressing nature, it's like we've been dealing with the economy, and the economy, it's like it's all very simple. You measure it with money, and the only one person really benefits from a given product. And now we're dealing with like, geez, nature, and what are all the benefits that people get from nature, and what are the effects of any given practice. And we're kind of raising the issue of needing like a whole different set of institutions to be able to really adequately address what is fair and what is efficient when it comes to natural systems. I think along those lines of complexity, I think there's actually really interesting questions regarding what the effect of a given tax will be on income distribution. And one example I'll use is the effect of Jeff Bezos being able to transport things all around the country, and the impact that that's had on small businesses. And so, if that massive transportation system was hit by, say, a carbon tax, would all of these small businesses all of a sudden stand a chance? I think we're sort of just beginning to wrestle with what the relationship is between all these complex factors in the economy. And I think along those lines, when it's really clear, like such and such rural person will be impacted by gas prices, there are mechanisms to offset that. But I also think there's a case to be made that in general, environmental protection can play a distributive role in society and in social systems as well.
I could just add that, yeah, well, if you're gonna have a carbon tax like you specifically asked, you have to find a way for the government to redistribute that through incentives to weatherize their homes, to pay for electric cars, whatever it's gonna take for you to move away from fossil fuels. You have to redistribute that to make it less expensive, and whatever energy increases happen, because companies can just try to charge people more if they are being charged carbon tax. You want to offset that at all costs for the poor and the middle class, and I think that's something that you can do to address the justice issue. By the way, I don't know if we're gonna have questions from the audience, but I would like to see what people are thinking, and at some point.
In France, they increased fuel prices a year or two ago. I can't remember when it was. As a bid toward something like carbon tax or environmental taxation, and that's what sparked the Yellow Vest movement, which was like a bunch of working people taking to the streets because they weren't having it, and they sort of messed up this like technocratic plan to change the price of fuel and like make a positive environmental difference. So like I think that's really strong evidence, and there's also evidence from other places that hasn't worked. So I think it's time to try something different.
So piggybacking off a little bit of talking about the fuel, are electric vehicle incentives and rebates a good idea? And then how do we reconcile the benefits of switching to electric power and the environmental and the humanitarian problems involved in the mining of lithium for batteries?
I'll come with a sort of big picture statement again, which is sort of going off the idea of seasons and cycles in nature. We've built an infrastructure in the United States, and I think we're gonna have to, it's not going to be easy to replace that infrastructure with a green infrastructure. And I think we sort of have to wrestle with that at a deep level. That's not an answer, but.
Yeah, like we have highways and roads, not a bunch of rails and canals, like we're set up for motor vehicles. And so like switching to electric vehicles because of the urgency of climate change feels to policymakers, especially like the only possible way. People like get to work in their cars, like a car-free lifestyle just isn't an option. Look at Vermont, like there's not a lot of flexibility for living without a car in most places in Vermont. Now, what we don't have here in Vermont is like a lot of lithium mines and copper mines to get the materials for those electric vehicles. And you can make like a resilience argument that maybe we should have that here if those resources are available at all. But I think that even bigger is a justice argument. Like if we want to have electric cars, like having the consequences be in somebody else's backyard is pretty unfair. And messed up, frankly. And so that's not like, I think electric cars right now are sort of a hot example of that, but that's throughout the economy. I think we like have an economy that through the market, places where there's more money, like Vermont, even folks who are like struggling to meet their basic needs in terms of like their actual material wealth in the United States tend to have a lot more. It's sort of this catch than people in other parts of the world. It's sort of this catch-22 in the United States where like people who are like by like like a biophysical, like what is their metabolism of materials in their lifestyle is pretty high, even if they don't feel economically secure because we don't have healthcare, because we have high rent and stuff like that. Where like those consequences are invisible to us, like through the power of the US military really is like make sure that like bad things happen in other places. And with electric cars is just one of many examples where I think that like for justice reasons that needs to be addressed. Like we have to decide what are the consequences we want to live with and what are the consequences we don't want to live with. And given that, what kind of economy do we want? Like what can we possibly, acknowledging the path dependency and acknowledging that we can't just change everything tomorrow. Like those conversations are important.
I could just add quickly that specifically to the electric car issue, that, okay, like Dave said, we have this system that is trying to perpetuate itself, right? That's literally what's happening. And it happens in politics, in the people in power, the oligarchies that thrive everywhere, it seems like. So they're trying to perpetuate this system, right? Electric cars is using that system that we have, and yet there is huge, massive problems with the lithium mines, I guess, in Bolivia, wherever you're gonna go and try to extract this precious material to make the batteries. But at the end of the day, people need transportation systems. So I would say we do need to have some sort of electrification of the transportation system, and electric cars are part of the solution. Somebody, my old advisor, Charlie Hall, a student used to ask him in the energy class, so what is your preferred energy source, or whatever? He was like, I don't like any of them. Nobody likes any of them. We don't like any of them. There are trade-offs to every single thing that we need. And what we need to do is ameliorate those problems that come with it. And I'm not saying that we should just be, consuming and whatever, but there's gonna have to be trade-offs that have to be made. And I'm gonna probably just is the time for me to use this graph that basically shows you here. I just want people to understand something. This is the Human Development Index, and this is the energy consumption per capita. You have a bunch of countries. As you get up here, that means you have a very high developed country. So the United States, I think, is like 300 over here, and most of these countries are European Union countries. What this shows is that you can have a very highly developed country, like you have a lot of countries in Europe consuming half as much of the energy of the United States, and still have even more equitable societies, because in many ways European countries are known to be very equitable because they have less wealth inequality. So if we're gonna do any of these transformation requiring electric cars or what have you, you have to be prioritizing cutting back on how much energy is being consumed by per capita, per person.
That's a tough one.
Yeah, I mean, the overall plan to fight climate change seems to be first electrify everything that you possibly can, and then make the electric grid all come from low carbon sources. That's renewable energy and controversially nuclear energy. But for a lot of people, nuclear energy isn't part of that solution. And when you're electrifying everything, even at like a stable overall energy consumption, say your energy consumption's here, your electricity consumption's here, well, as you like aren't growing energy consumption, you're using more and more electricity as you're not burning those fuels directly. And so to try to convert the entire electric grid, all our sources of electricity into renewables as we're consuming more electricity overall, well, you're just adding renewables to make up for the growth basically, and you're not able to take any gas-fired or coal-fired power plants off the grid. And that's like might be a little bit of a technical description, but what I'm saying is that when you're putting solar panels up, when you're putting wind turbines up, right now there's not much evidence that they're replacing anything, they're just adding. And electric vehicles are frankly part of that right now.
Yeah, we're in a situation.
Okay, it's kind of a multi-part question next. So, and the second part of the question depends on how you answer the first part of the question. So we've been talking about all these problems with growth, and the question is, who's truly at fault here? Is it politicians making these policies? And then based off of however you respond, who should then be responsible for bearing the costs of these solutions? Should it be the consumers? Should it be the industry? Both, neither?
I keep going first. Somebody else take the reins here.
Well, I could just say everyone is at fault at this point. I mean, every single human that consumes fossil fuels is at fault, if you're gonna place fault on anyone. But I don't think at this point it's even helpful to place blame on anyone. What is important to emphasize though is we shouldn't be blaming the general public at large. You know, like I said, corporations, but especially fossil fuel corporations, they want the system to perpetuate. They want everything to be plastic. So it's another revenue for them because plastic comes from fossil fuels. That's why we are flooded with plastic. And they found plastic in lungs of people now. Like this week, I saw the news. I mean, are you kidding me? Like
The drinking water.
This should be wake-up calls at this point that we should not be making everything just plastic. But at the end of the day, I think people wherever they are need to rise up and need to understand. First of all, need to be educated to a point that they can understand what their role is, and then take the power back. Right, the people ultimately, this is a democracy, thankfully, and they can make choices. There's a lot of choices to be made. And the choices were made in 2020. The hope has been that something would happen, right, at the federal level, so you can have the funding, because everything comes down to, can you afford any transformation, even for the state of Vermont? Like, let's come back to Vermont. Vermont has done a lot. Apparently, the grid, at least in Burlington, is 100% renewable, right? That's what everyone says. But then, like, I don't know, there is like so much like beyond Burlington. What can we do to help people weatherize their homes? All those things require investment, and all we can hope for is that they will come. And but the blame, I guess, if you're gonna play blame on anyone, is on the grid on the American greed, if you will, that has been perpetuated, and neoliberalism, something that people ignore. This thing that has been promoting, reinforcing this, positive feedback loop since the 80s has definitely been to play, and we need to move away from it. We need to have a system that is hybrid. The government needs to intervene, and you still need to kind of have a market, but it can just be like, whatever, just let the invisible hand, like I was saying at the beginning, deal with it, because it's not gonna, there is no invisible hand to deal with.
I think there's like I kind of agree with this idea that like it's not that important who to blame. I think overall, like the countries that have gotten wealthy and powerful by burning lots of fossil fuels owe a lot to the countries that didn't get wealthy and powerful burning fossil fuels and are now like underwater or burning or experiencing other like massive disruptions because of environmental change and the climate breakdown. But at the level of like, oh, is it politicians' fault? Is it corporations' fault? Yeah, all of the above. Regular people's fault too, a little bit, like we have our like there's too much cognitive dissonance to know that the ways we're going about our daily lives are like actively harmful to others elsewhere who we don't know. And so like we resolve that by like sort of like taking the blame off ourselves. The idea that there's like the idea that like regular people need to change their habits and that's going to fix things is wrong, but also the idea that like we're going to have a policy change or some sort of technological change that makes it so regular people don't have to change their habits is also totally wrong. Like we need, like, it's a co-evolving system like Skylar keeps talking about, where like we need the sorts of policy changes that make it possible to change our habits, to make it possible to like live well and feel secure without having so much stuff, without burning so much fossil fuels in our daily lives. We need the sorts of policy change also that like makes it possible for like us to take control of our own energy and make it renewable, like that looks different in different places, like in Vermont, because of the population density and what we have here, which are trees, like wood burning isn't the worst possible thing. Yeah, if 8 billion people in the world burned wood for their heating and cooking, that would be a huge problem. But in other places, photovoltaic panels are going to work all year long and produce energy. So I think it looks different in different places what's needed, but it's like quite clear that that change, to mitigate climate change, not ignoring even the sort of like adapting and being resilient to climate change, just to like get off fossil fuels, involves change at sort of all levels of government and life, which is terrifying and also like kind of difficult to say, okay, so who goes first?
Okay, we're getting some questions in the chat. So if it's okay with everyone, maybe we can start to address those. So this one's a long one, kind of addressing human nature. Is it possible that part of the reason that we pursue perpetual economic growth is that our species is evolved to develop strategies to overcome scarcity? Perhaps we are biologically programmed to fear a time when we will not have enough. What if we took care of everyone's basic needs? Do you think that if we did so, there would be less fear and less support for economic policies that always prioritize growth?
I'll go first. Yes, so the last part, like if we took care of everyone's basic needs, there might be less fear and less support for economic policies that always prioritize growth. It is, like labor unions, for example, tend to be pro-growth, even if they know that it's bad for the environment, because labor unions are in the business of making sure there's work. So while I do believe that, the premise that it's because of something that has to do with human nature, I'd be careful about that personally. There have been societies in many different times and places that have not had economic growth for like millennia, and like had even institutions to prevent economic growth. Some of them like strike us in our culture as like horrific, like infanticide, for example. Like there's a lot of tribal societies where like they kill babies. That's what they do, and it prevents economic growth. But there's other ways to do it too, luckily, ways that like can fit within our moral system, our moral code. But I don't think like human nature is like one of like growth and conquest and exploitation. I think there's a lot of different things, different like human possibilities, and we have a society that is like well designed to nurture and cultivate our like needs for growth and exploitation and colonization. You know, like the like exploring of outer space, for example, for science, like in a capitalist economic system, we're seeing it already turn into like colonization, getting resources from space, space being like a luxury travel destination for the rich, like all things that are related to growth, rather than like we live in this universe, let's go explore it because that's like sounds like something cool to do and learn about.
I can just quickly add to that. The first part of that question is very interesting. There's a lot of biological determinism, I guess they can call it sometimes, where in fact there is a need for a species to be able, what they call in biology, to propel your genes into the future. You need to be able to meet your own needs and then have a little more, right? A little surplus to be able to meet that of your offsprings. And that's like a natural thing that you can observe in the environment. And so it's very natural, it's very logical. And but what has happened in the past 100 years, especially since the 1950s, is that only because of fossil fuels we have been growing exponentially. And I remember I was talking about Donald Meadows. Donald Meadows was all about thinking in systems, thinking about the reinforcing loops and the negative feedback, the stabilizing feedback loops. And what we're doing now is a positive exponential growth that we're trying to maintain, and it has only been possible in the history of humanity because of cheap, abundant fossil fuels. So that's why where we are now. If fossil fuels hadn't been discovered, if that hadn't happened, which by the way, fossil fuels are solar energy stored from like 100 million years ago. If that hadn't happened, I guess we would have continued to grow slowly. If you see that there's data we have, you can see the pretty flat, the economic growth, and until it's like, you know, you start putting all this energy into work, you start seeing this growth that we're now trying to stabilize and hopefully decline. Because a lot of the growth, by the way, this is the biggest problem. Politicians and everyone keeps talking about, they all talk about growth, right? The president's always like, we need to grow the economy. Most of the growth that we see here or around the world actually is not even as beneficial as you would think for the general public. It ultimately goes to the people who own the wealth. That the wealth is, when people say you have, you know, the United States has this very high wealth per capita. There is no such thing. Most of the wealth is concentrated. So whatever you keep adding to the GDP is actually going to enrich the wealthy, and while you destroy the environmental foundation and maintain people inequality. So growth is not good. Just growth for the sake of growth is not good. There is need for growth at certain times. That I'm gonna give you, but the way the system is structured right now is a lot of the growth we are seeing is just to maintain unsustainability that is ultimately gonna lead us to have to change, because it's gonna force us. We can plan it, or we'll just blindly go see what happens.
I guess I'll just add that, yeah, there's so many forces that are driving the system in its current form. One thing I was sort of startled by being in the DC area is how much the ethos all revolves around thinking about competition with China, or, you know, competition with Russia, or whatever it is. It's like the super organism always sort of in that scarce mindset of we have to stay on the top. And I don't really know if there's a great way to overcome it. I know a lot of people talk about within groups, it becomes much more easy to develop a shared sense of purpose, cooperation, and that sort of thing. And then outside of groups, it's really difficult to do that. And so one idea is, well, we need this global sense of group. And another idea would be that, people in their own heart have to weigh these judgments and decisions and sort of go about it that way. But yeah, I don't know.
I want to add one thing, because my only example of an institution to prevent growth was infanticide, and I feel like we can do better. And also do right by those societies that have come up with clever ways to prevent growth. And really what it comes down to is every society, other than in like exceptional times of shortage or scarcity because of environmental conditions or whatever other disruption, every society has more than it needs, either because it produces more than it needs or it has excess time and could produce more than they need. And so the key for preventing growth is to like use that surplus for things other than like organizing to produce more next time. So what happens in capitalism is the investors get their profit, or the owners of the means of production get their profit, and then a lot of that gets reinvested to expand the like stock of machines and factories that are producing, to produce more next time. And of course, a lot of this is like financial and services and things like that. So it's a little more complicated than your like industrial capitalism model at this point, but that's basically what's happening. Other societies have things like annual big festivals to sort of like piss away the surplus in a big party, or like they build monuments. These are like the strategies for non-growth, is basically to like worship gods in a destructive way, or like like a lot of the things are like really just like super inefficient. And I like talking about this in a conversation about the environment with environmentalists, because like environmentalism in the last 50 years has become so efficiency based, is because so like we need to be more efficient with our energy. Well, of course, we need to like have like cars that get better mileage per gallon, or houses that don't lose so much heat in the winter. But like the fact that we need to organize all of society around being efficient is exactly the problem. Like it's sort of like we need to use our resources most efficiently so we can like produce the most possible and then invest it to produce even more. I think that's like the wrong way of thinking about how to organize a society. And when we look to other times and places where they've avoided growth, it's because they're investing in something else besides the economy.
I just want to tack onto that. I actually wrote down a few what I'd call like the paradoxes of efficiency, and I kind of sum up one. Is it sustainable for a small apartment in Manhattan to be worth more than 100 acres of land in Vermont? And the idea is, on the one hand, it's very ecologically economically efficient for a small apartment, that doesn't use that much resources to be worth so much. You're getting a lot of money for very little material resource. On the other hand, that creates a huge inequality, a huge leveraging, where we're not actually valuing our land. We're not actually valuing our raw materials. So similarly, should we be investing in solar energy or new iPhones? Well, new iPhones are, this big and use this amount of rare earths, whereas solar panels use, way more dollar per resource, right? So, and I guess the last interesting one revolves around, should we be investing in ExxonMobil or Google? And in each case, we have this far over leveraging where we're deciding that something is worth way more than Earth systems. And so in some cases, those are efficient, but in others, they're driving the further basically extraction of Earth systems. And that's why we emphasize sustainable scale of the economy so much.
Great. Well, we only have less than 10 minutes left, but I think that the next question in the chat from Erin has a good introduction to a nice little conclusion. She asked, if action of the people is the solution, as far as a solution can go, how would you propose making sure that people are educated to understand their own position locally and globally?
like we need to get organized and do what the right wing's doing. Take over school boards. I don't know. Like right now, there's like in different levels of government, like at the level of like the school district all the way up to the state, like people with like what like folks in this, I would assume, conversation think are pretty evil intentions, or at least misguided intentions, are like trying to make it illegal to teach kids about race and racism, or about like gender and queerness. And we need to make it illegal to teach kids like things that are false about the environment and the climate, as well as things that are false about race and racism and the history of the United States and sex and gender and stuff like that. So I think that like education's like a huge battleground, and like the right wing's super well organized. And I think that like there's a bunch of liberals who just kind of want to like stop them instead of play offense.
I'm a huge believer in education, and I think that we need to have, for people to understand, like the person asking the question is their position locally and globally. They need to understand how the economy works, the role of energy, how energy is the great equalizer, as I call it, between humans and the rest of nature. We all need energy inputs. That's what we all share, and is very, it's a commonality that I like to, and people need to understand those basics, be able to not only understand them, but take action on them, and understanding what an ecological economy will be like. We're working at the here at the Gun Institute with the leadership of the Ecological, which is our program, my program, and something that Sam is part of in a way too. Creating a new website, for example, to mainstream ecological economics, so you don't have to go through reading journal articles that nobody's going to be reading. The general public is not going to be reading, only academics. We need to take, because the academic system, by the way, in itself is trying to perpetuate its own, not only the system, the system that is the problem, but itself, which is also the problem. So taking it, my vision is take it out of the academic system, put it online, make sure that is mainstream, easy access, is readable for the. That's how I take my own approach to that, and we hopefully this summer will that'll be ready. And we're also planning a crash course on ecological economics this summer. 1 week is not about credits. It's about learning the material and understanding the paradigm shift that we need in economic thinking to actually understand our position locally and globally.
I'm not sure if this definitely isn't the answer. This is maybe an answer that's less about power or whatever. Going back to this quote, Immanuel Kant, an organized product in nature is one which is reciprocally ends and means. I've been sort of settling into this idea lately that in nature, function can be beautiful, right? Like, for birders, a bird song is fulfilling a purpose, but it also is something a birder is willing to go see and considers sort of an end in and of itself. And I think we have a great way in this society of detaching function from what we think is beautiful, right? It's like you go work all day or push really hard and then leisure and that sort of stuff. And I think the more we can sort of bring those two together and feel like we're both contributing and fulfilling a purpose and, getting fulfillment, making meaning from that experience, the more we're going to be able to get within the bounds of the earth.
Yeah, and I would just add quickly, I know we have to go, but the ultimate question, what are we trying to sustain, right? That's kind of like what we need to really realize and grapple with, because the earth has gone through transformation, geological transformations that have shaped the planet over and over again. Things, meaning that things have, whatever we see right now probably wasn't there before. So a lot of the wilderness and a lot of it's considered very, very, very humanistic way of perceiving nature. Ultimately, I think we have to understand that we are connected and move beyond all of that. But really, what are we trying to sustain? And I think we're trying to sustain human quality of life while protecting the rest of nature, and to live happily and thriving, because that's what gives meaning to it all. But it will depend on how, as a society, how we understand that.
So I know we're wrapping up here. We have one more question from the audience, and then we're gonna have just a small section for final thoughts, and maybe some other things too. So the last question, if you want to answer, it can be short, is the question of sustainability, according to David Blackburn in The Conquest of Nature, is when do needs become wants, and who will decide which wants deserve to be satisfied?
Over the last century, perhaps, but definitely in the last few decades, like it's been the opposite. Like wants have become needs. Like things that were like a luxury have become a necessity. A cell phone, for example. But like what gets satisfied is a question of like money and power and like thinly veiled force to an extent. Ultimately, a question of like wealth and property, which is all protected by the police, who, if you try to mess with it, will intervene with force. And I teach economics and like to bring that up with my students. Like we say we live in a democracy, but like the economy is not democratic at all. It's like operates on like, if anything, $1, one vote instead of one person, one vote. And so like if the big questions are like what wants deserve to be satisfied, how are we going to satisfy them, with what resources, those sorts of questions, like having more democratic systems than buying and selling is like the step in the direction that I think would end up leading toward sustainability, because those like more democratic systems get the voices at the table who might be affected by the negative repercussions of others' actions.
I'll just say I think that's a really interesting, that's sort of the question, and I don't have a great answer. Yeah. That one principle is, live by the sword, die by the sword, right? And I think nature kind of keeps score, and we'll see what happens.
I think the ultimate realization, like I was saying before, what are we trying to sustain? The Audubon Society, right, is trying to, it's all about the birds, right? So the birds have this special role in the ecosystems. And that's what we're looking at, right? We have a special role as well as human beings, and we have to be stewards of the birds as much as we are of ourselves. And at this point in time, I think most of humanity, or at least in the United States, in Western civilization, it has become more about me. Like some people tell me sometimes. And then about we, it's about we. As a nature, every birds, everyone, and I think that's what we need to keep promoting more of, and find ways to get at people. Like I was saying, my ways, energy connects us. Others might have other ways, but I think finding ways to connect.
Great. Well, it's a little after 7:30. Thank you so much, Rigo, Skylar, and Sam. And David linked the Audubon website in the chat for anyone that's interested on how to take action to protect birds and the places people live in as well. Just going to the Audubon website in the chat. But yeah, thank you so much. That's really informative. Yeah.
Thanks for putting this together and coming up with such great questions, and being interested to listen to us banter at each other.
Yeah, thank you all.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Take care.